Hi, everyone. My name is Dr. Justin Essery. I'm an assistant professor here at Rice University. Welcome to the International Methods Colloquium. The IMC is a periodic online interactive seminar discussion on the application of quantitative statistical methodology to the social sciences, sponsored by Rice University and the National Science Foundation. This week's speaker is Jane Lawrence Sumner from the University of Minnesota. She's giving a talk entitled Measuring Personalism in Non-Democracies. Jane's talk will last between 30 to 40 minutes, after which point we will take questions from the audience. You can ask a question using the Zoom Q&A button that appears at the bottom of the webinar window. A link to Jane's paper and her slideshow, I misspoke. Just a link to Jane's slideshow will be available in the Zoom webinar chat window so that you can refer to slides throughout the presentation. I'll post that link in the chat window right after I'm done with this little introductory speech. And now I'd like to welcome Jane to the IMC. Jane, welcome.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. Thank you, Justin, for having me. And thank you all of my internet friends in the ether for tuning in. So yeah, I am Dr. Jane Lawrence Sumner. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Minnesota, coming to you live from surprisingly balmy Minneapolis, Minnesota. Thank you, global warming. This paper I'm going to present today is entitled Measuring Personalism in Non-Democracies, which is seeming especially relevant these days. And this is co-authored with Jennifer Gandhi at Emory University. And we're very excited to be presenting this paper to you today because we are almost done with our second round of data collection. And so we're really excited to hear some feedback on additional data that we could collect. So we're going to start the talk today by playing my favorite comparative politics drinking game, which is Name That Autocrat. And this is actually a particularly easy game. This is the warm-up round, I suppose. So all of these autocrats are people that you probably recognize from the news. So here in the sumptuous yellow, we have Muammar Gaddafi. Muammar Gaddafi, you may know from his conflictual relationships with the international community, but also, perhaps more trivially, for his troop of all-women bodyguards. In the middle here, we have Islam Karimov. Karimov was in the news a lot in this past fall because he was so inseparable from the state of Uzbekistan that his death actually plunged the country into a weeks-long state of uncertainty, not only over their future, but over whether or not he had in fact died. And then here, in the lovely leopard print hat, we have Mobutu Sese Seko, who was the leader of the Democratic Republic of the Congo. He is known for many things, perhaps most amusingly from my point of view, for the fact that his name, Mobutu Sese Seko, which he adopted while he was in power, is actually short for a longer name, which translates in English to the all-powerful warrior who, because of his endurance and inflexible will to win, goes from conquest to conquest, leaving fire in his wake, because he is not into the whole brevity thing. Okay, so why am I showing you pictures of these autocrats? The reason I'm showing you pictures of these autocrats is that the fact that they are so easily recognizable is in itself an indicator that these are autocrats from regimes that are characterized by high levels of personalism. And personalism is the thing I'm going to be talking about today. So what is personalism? Personalism we can define fairly concisely as rule unbounded by rules. So the rule of autocrats that is unconstrained by institutions. And these leaders become so recognizable because without institutional constraints on their power, leaders are able to act however they want. They're able to indulge their basest instincts. They're able to behave in sometimes outlandish ways, sometimes very cruel ways, as we'll discuss in a minute. And so personalist dictators tend to adhere to the traditional view of autocracy as rule by one man. So if I were to ask you to come up with an autocrat off the top of your head, or perhaps if I were to ask an undergraduate to do that, the odds are very good that the first person that would come to mind would be someone who is the head of a regime that is characterized by very high levels of personalism. So in today's talk, I'm going to talk about the problems with the existing measures of personalism. I'm then going to talk about how what we're trying to do in this broader project is to infer personalism from acting like a personalist. So in other words, dispense with institutions almost entirely and instead focus on dictator behaviors or autocrat behaviors. I'm going to show you that our measure works really well for known cases, and also provides some much needed nuance to cases with their provide nuance to the institutional categorizations of some known cases. I'm then going to talk through the comparison between our measures and existing measures, and just to highlight or telegraph ahead of time, other measures predict our measure quite well, but there is still a lot that's left to be explained, which we think is fodder for interesting additional theorizing. And then, as I said at the beginning of the talk, we're nearing the end of the second wave of data collection. What I'm presenting today is from our first wave of data collection. And so I'm going to discuss where we intend to go with this project in the next few months. So we're going to start with the motivation. So why do we care about personalists apart from the fact that they have fantastic hats? Personalists are different from other types of autocratic regimes. Personalist regimes are different in ways that matter. So in particular, we know from the literature that personalist regimes tend to exhibit more conflictual behavior internationally, as I suggested when I showed you the picture of Muammar Gaddafi. Along with that, they're less likely to engage in cooperative behavior. So they're less likely to sign trade agreements, they're less likely to sign security agreements, they're generally just less likely to be good global citizens. They're different domestically. They rely more on resource rents, they tend to attract less investment, and they fare less well economically than other autocratic regimes. Their regimes are more likely to end violently and suddenly, and in this violent and sudden end, their leaders are more likely to experience exile or death. So in other words, I expect you to care about us being able to characterize personalism because we have all of these theories about how personalists are different. So what is the problem with existing measures of personalism? So existing measures of personalism tend to focus on the institutional constraints side. And that makes a lot of sense because I defined personalism as rule without rules. So it's behavior that's unbounded by these institutional constraints. So naturally, you might think it makes a lot of sense to measure the institutional constraints and say, when they're not there, we have personalism. And so that's what these existing measures have mostly done. So people often use the executive constraints or ex-const measure from polity. Some others have used Polcon, Witthenish's Polcon. And more often, and perhaps the best known measure, is the Geddes Right in France categorical measure of authoritarian regimes. Now, I just said it makes a lot of sense to focus on the institutions, but there are three big problems with trying to infer personalism from institutions. The first one is that autocratic institutions are really complicated. So our definition says that personalism flourishes in an atmosphere of reduced institutional constraints, but we don't always know that autocratic institutions actually constrain. There is some evidence that in some cases, in some countries, some institutions do constrain the power of the executive, but there is also evidence that just as often autocratic institutions do not constrain, but instead do other things. And this is a problem if we're trying to construct a measure of personalism that's based on institutions that constrain. We just don't know which ones actually constrain. The second problem is that even if we were to isolate the universe of autocratic institutions that do constrain the executive's behavior, institutions constrain, but a lack of institutions only enables. So put another way, just because you can doesn't mean you will. So we know on the positive end of institutions, the more institutional constraints you have, the less able you are to act freely, but it doesn't necessarily logically follow that if you have a lack of these institutions, that you will choose to act in this way. We only know that you can. And the third problem is that institutions, as many of us know, are very sticky. They don't change a great deal from year to year or within regimes. And this tends to lend itself very naturally to a categorical, time-invariant measure of autocracy or of personalism. And this is a problem because theoretically, personalism is continuous, and theoretically, personalism can vary over time. So we believe, and theories of personalism suggest, that within a regime, the regime itself can become more personalist or less personalist over time. And in fact, these changes in personalism predict theoretically interesting outcomes. So the inability to get to this time variance is a problem. So the intuition behind our solution to this problem is that personalism is one of those things where you know it when you see it. I can show you those pictures of those three autocrats, and we have a good sense just from looking at them and reading their histories that those are personalist dictators. But we don't need to know about the institutions necessarily to know that that's true. So what we focus on instead of the institutions is this idea of acting like a personalist. And when I say that, as I said, we focus on actions instead of institutions. And what we do is we construct basically a list of personalist questions. So behaviors that we believe theoretically would only be allowable in the absence of relevant institutional constraints. So these are behaviors they can only get away with if they're not constrained. But it doesn't require us to know which institutions might constrain. So this, just like many IRT models, is very similar to psychological and educational tests, where we're trying to infer some latent characteristic from the way that students or patients respond to questions on a test. So in a sense, we're basically constructing a sort of BuzzFeed-style personality quiz of autocratic regimes. And as I just said, we use these questions and we use an IRT model to estimate personalism from observable behaviors, just like you would in the psych literature, they estimate narcissism from observable behaviors. We're doing very much the same thing, but with personalism. So the indicators that we're looking at right now fall in 4 general categories. And as I said, these are the data that we collected in the first round. So these are the most easily accessible indicators. And they tend to fall in 4 general categories or families of behaviors. And I'm going to talk about these in turn. But first, we have term limits. Then we have data on military purges, data on civilian purges, and then data on cabinets. So right now, we're mostly dealing with the personnel management side of personalism. At the end of the talk, I'll talk about the other data that we're collecting to try to get a more nuanced picture of personalism. So the first data source that we have is from Batoro on term limits. So conditional upon a regime or a leader having a term limit, did they choose to break the term limit? And as you can see, this behavior is fairly uncommon, but it does actually happen. The second measure that we're looking at is the size of military purges. This is from June Koga's work. And we categorize this as dichotomous measures of, did you have a low-level military purge? Did you have a medium-level military purge? And did you have a high-level military purge? And as you can see, low-level military purges, small purges are fairly common. Medium-level and high-level military purges are relatively uncommon. So these are behaviors we think we can learn a lot from. In addition to the size of the military purge, we have data on who was purged. So we can tell if the target of the purge was a soldier, a mid-level officer, or a high-level officer. And as you can see, soldier purges are extremely rare. They do happen. It's actually sort of hard to see that bar because they are so rare. And this makes a lot of sense because how often do soldiers really pose, individual soldiers really pose a threat to the regime? Mid-level officer purges are somewhat more common. High-level officer purges are extremely common. Relative to other types of purges, but not relative to not having a purge at all. So our third category of data that we're using right now is on civilian purges. And this is the intensity of the purge. So is it a low-level, low-intensity domestic purge, medium-level, high-level, very high-level? So low-level is you're only purging a couple of civilians, medium-level is 10 to 100, and so on. And what we can see is that low-level, very small domestic purges are fairly common. Medium, high, and very high are much less common. Although it's hard to see there, very high-level domestic purges do actually happen. And then our last measure is from Banks, and this is data on cabinet changes. And again, this is the intensity, the magnitude of the cabinet change, not the direction. We measure this by looking at the change from year to year in the size of the cabinet. So if it doesn't change or changes very little, we consider that a low-level cabinet change. If the size of the cabinet fluctuates a lot, an awful lot, that's medium, high, or very high level. And so from all of these, what we hope to infer is these behaviors are things that you cannot do in the presence of institutional constraints. And so we hope that from looking at these behaviors, we can infer personalism. So really quickly, I'm going to go through the model because this is nothing in particular that most of you don't already know. So we estimate a standard Bayesian IRT model that you see in front of you, dichotomous indicators with a logit link. We use dynamic priors, where the first year of any regime, according to the GWF measure, we have a standard normal prior on that level of personalism, but every subsequent year, the level of personalism the prior is normally distributed, centered on the previous year's personalism, with a fairly tight prior, and I'm happy to take questions about that later. The discrimination parameter here is bounded below at 0 so that the model is identified. So in other words, we orient all of our indicators so that higher levels always indicate more personalism and the low value always indicates less personalism. This is just for orientation purposes. In this case, both the discrimination and the difficulty parameters have standard normal priors. And we estimate the model using STAN. So we run 4 chains, 2,000 iterations, and we discard the first half as burn-in. So now I'm going to walk you through the estimates and show you how our estimates correspond with some known cases. So where the history tells us what the answer is, we're going to see if our estimates get it right. I'm going to start with the easy cases just to show that there's, validity in the easy cases. And so the first case we have here is Spain. Spain is a very easy case in that it has very high levels of personalism, indicated by these red lines here. So red indicates that the country was in the top quartile of personalism in any given year. So Spain is among the highest personalist regimes in any given year under Franco. And then after we see democratization in the late 70s, it tapers off and becomes a democracy. And then we see very low levels of personalism. So this is promising. If we saw that Franco had very low levels of personalism or that democracy had very high levels of personalism, that would be troubling. So this is a good gut check on the measure. Another easy case is the case of Iraq. Iraq is in the highest level of personalism for every single year for which we have data. And that, again, corresponds to what we would believe about Iraq, especially under Saddam Hussein. Similarly, we see that Tunisia has extremely high levels of personalism for the duration of its regime under Ben Ali. And then another good case here is Mexico. So Mexico was an authoritarian regime, but it was not a personalist authoritarian regime. It was a party authoritarian regime. And accordingly, we see it has medium or low or very, very low levels of personalism throughout. So I show this just to convince you that I'm not just picking up on dictators. I'm not just picking up on autocracy. We're actually picking up on personalism or something very closely related to it. So now let's move on to the hard cases. So the harder cases here are cases where the personalism changes or is particularly nuanced. And what I'm going to show you is that we really add to the institutional measures that don't pick up on those changes or that nuance. So the first case here, this is Uzbekistan. Now, as I said at the beginning, Islam Karimov took over as the leader of Uzbekistan upon independence. However, at the very beginning of his regime, he was ruling with a party, and the party had some constraints on him. He was less able to act freely. As the regime ages, though, he is able to dispense with the party and consolidate his own power. So our data only go up to 2008, but as we saw in the news in 2016 when he passed away, by that point he had consolidated so much power in himself and was so unconstrained that it was actually unclear who was supposed to succeed him, if he had even died, and how the regime was going to continue in his absence. Another more difficult case here is going to be South Korea. So South Korea is typically considered to be a military dictatorship during the period in the middle here, so between periods of democracy. But it's actually quite a bit more nuanced than that. So early on in the regime, we don't have that much information, but when Park takes over, the line right after 1960, each of these lines indicates a regime change. Park initially is constrained by the military. So he is General Park. He is part of the military. He is ruling with the military. He wins his second election. So he starts dispensing with the military and consolidating his own power. He's winning elections. In 1971, he wins his second election. We see personalism is already on the upswing and is very high by that point. And he declares a state of emergency. He begins rewriting the Constitution, which changes the presidential term. He starts engaging in torturing the opposition. He declared martial law in 1979, at which point you can see personalism starts to taper off, and he's assassinated. At that point, another military general comes into power and is more constrained by the military. And then in the late 80s, as you can see, South Korea democratizes and personalism tapers off. So this is a case where this entire spell of time, this entire regime, is typically considered a military dictatorship. And yet what we can see is personalism that rises and falls in ways that correspond with our historical understanding of the country. Another really great example here, a harder case, is Indonesia. So Indonesia is clearly personalist, and we take no gripes with existing measures under Sukarno, so in this first period of time. I keep pointing at the screen as if you can tell what I'm pointing at. Clearly personalist, and our measure picks up that he's clearly personalist. Now, in this next period of time, where Suharto takes over, this is often coded as party military personalist. And we think that it's coded that way because it changes. And at different points in time, it is all of those things individually. So in the late 70s, Suharto, who was originally part of the military, resigns from the military. So we see a fairly high level of personalism going into this period in which he resigns and replaces the military with civilian rule. However, he begins to replace the civilians that help him to rule his country with people who are exceptionally loyal to him. They owe their job, their livelihood to him, and are no longer really checking his power as his time in power continues. And this loyalty allows him to consolidate power and become more personalist because he is less constrained. And so in this time period, we see personalism rising. It starts to fall around the time the economy falters. And after that, we see that democratization occurs and personalism falls off. So this is another case where our measure is able to pick up nuance, where other measures tend to just code it as one thing for the entire duration. So the next thing I'm going to do is show you some comparisons with existing measures. So all of these are going to be linear models in which we try to predict our measure using existing measures just to see how well they correspond. And when we do this with xconst from polity, we see that there's generally agreement, although there's a lot of variation. So when executive constraints are very low, so when executive constraints are 1, our predicted personalism is at its highest. And as executive constraints increase, we see a decrease in the degree of personalism. And this makes sense because as the constraints decrease, the ability to engage in personalist behavior increases. But we still do observe a lot of variation in how much personalist behavior we see at every level of institutional constraints. Next, this is PolCon 3, and we see very much the same thing. When PolCon is very low, when it's around 0, we see the highest levels of predicted personalism in our model, and this decreases as PolCon increases. So as the constraints increase, the degree of personalism decreases. Perhaps more interesting is to look at how our measure corresponds with the often used Geddes-Wright in France categorical indicator of authoritarian regimes. And so to remind you again, red here indicates very high levels of personalism, among the highest quartile. Yellow is one step below, light blue is a step below that, dark blue is going to be the lowest. And what we see is that cases that they code as being democracies, monarchies, or that they don't code tend to have the lowest levels of our measure of personalism, which we think basically makes sense. Democracies should be, well, maybe at least until current events, very low on personalism.
Hey, Jane, there's a clarifying question that came in. I thought we should answer this now.
Okay.
Is the unit of analysis country year or leader year or what?
It's regime year.
Regime year. Okay.
Yeah.
And are there's also, are the values recorded as of January 1st or December 31st? What's the date?
I don't remember, but we did go through to make sure that they were all the same for all the measures. I just don't remember which one we did.
Okay. Yep.
Mm-hmm. So what we see is that oligarchy actually has our highest levels of personalism. And then the cases that they identify as personalism or military personal or party military personal are all sort of moderately high by our measure. Okay, so to conclude, what I'm showing you right now is only the beginning. As I said, you might more accurately characterize what we've measured so far as sort of a degree of personnel management. But this is an ongoing project. So this is part of a much larger effort that we're engaging in. And our data collection is still ongoing. Our second wave of data collection is supposed to end at the end of this month, ideally. So what we're looking at, what we're collecting right now, other indicators of personalism, other ways you would know personalism when you saw it. We're looking at succession. So who took over when the leader left? Was there a plan in place? Did the leader name their own successor, and so on? We're looking at patterns in their family. So did their family members take on high levels or very important jobs in their regime or not? What happened to their family going forward? One of my favorite examples of this is that Karimov's daughter is actually a pop star, but I got vetoed for using that as a measure. We're looking at their publication record, so whether they published books of ideology or not. And more recently, actually starting this week, we are collecting data on tweets from current dictators, trying to see if personalist dictators communicate in different ways to different audiences and using different words than non-personalist dictators. So with that caveat that this is just the beginning, what I've shown you today is a measure of personalism that we're working to develop that comes from action, not institutions. So do you behave like a personalist, and how do we know? And this is important because we argue that institutional measures can lead to miscategorization and they can lack nuance. We think that this project has a lot of exciting potential going forward, which is in part why we're so excited to hear all of your feedback. Because eventually this is going to permit us to test a much wider range of theories in which we have a continuous measure, or where we actually want to theorize about what happens when personalism changes. And the distinctions that we found between the institutional measures and our behavioral measure, we think, are particularly ripe for future theorizing, especially about the role of authoritarian institutions in constraining the executive. So with that, I'm going to stop, welcome Justin back, say thank you, and if you want to get in touch, there's my information.
Jane, thanks very much for that presentation. At this point, Jane Lawrence Sumner is available to take questions from the audience. You can ask a question using the Zoom Q&A button that appears at the bottom of the webinar window. And while we're waiting for some questions to come in,
I should say one thing about the clarifying question, by the way.
Yeah.
On the model as regime year and as country year, and it doesn't make much difference except for where you see regime changes within country. We've also run it as leader year. And again, if you have countries in which the regime had multiple leaders, then because of the way that our priors are set up, you see a much jumpier measure, because every time the leader would change, we're just doing another random draw. So, but generally our estimates don't fluctuate a great deal apart from that.
You know, the measure is predicated on the premise that you know, personalism is as personalism does. Mm-hmm. And it reminds me, a lot of these IRT measures are like this, right? It's the measures of ideology where essentially if you vote in certain ways, that must mean you're a certain kind of person. Mm-hmm. And I wonder if, firstly, if there is conceptually, not as a measurement matter, but conceptually, is there a difference between a personalist regime and a regime that, for example, purges a lot of people, or undertakes certain, basically does the things? Is there a difference between a regime that changes its cabinet a lot and a personalist regime?
So there could be, conceptually, which is why we're trying to capture all of these different measures and not just personnel management. So one of the reasons why we want to include all of these measures, but not lean too heavily on any of them, is because when we talk about personnel management, this is generally the way that you're working to consolidate your power and you're working to protect yourself. There are many different ways you can do this. So you could have a very personalist regime that doesn't purge a lot of people, but has a lot of cabinet changes, or has a lot of cabinet changes, but never purges the military. And that's going to be a function of all of these other characteristics. So where do they derive their power from? Do they need to consolidate their power more? One would expect that these are actually behaviors, especially the purge data, that's going to happen very early in a regime. Mm-hmm. But once you've consolidated your power like that, you really just don't need to purge as much. And so that's why all of them are important, but none of them individually are really going to capture anything useful for our purposes.
Yeah, that's kind of what I was getting at. In some of these cases, the behavior seems like the kind of thing you do when you want to become a personalist, right? You start appointing loyalists to your security services. You divide, you divide authority among your subordinates, so they're sort of in conflict with each other and they're struggling with each other. And that doesn't define a personalist regime. That's what you need to be to become one, right?
Yeah, exactly. And that's why we're trying to capture things that happen at all different levels, at all different points along your sort of personalism, personal adventure, right? So things that are going to happen near the end, things that are going to happen in the middle. So ways not only that you consolidate power, which is mostly what we're focused on now, but also ways that you act with that consolidated behavior going forward. And right now, we don't have any of those acting variables. We really mostly just have consolidating variables. But that's why we're trying to collect all this other data.
So some questions have come in. So the first one from an anonymous viewer is more of a clarifying question. Where does the authoritarian regime leader case come from? And then there are some abbreviations. I'm not sure what they mean. GWF, DD, Milan's Folic, or Archegos.
So I think what they're asking is how are we defining who's an autocrat to include in the sample initially? I believe that is the measure. Or I believe that's the question. If that's the question, the answer is DD. We define as our initial sample all regime years that had at least 1 year of dictatorship as defined by DD between 1945 and the present. So you don't have to be an authoritarian regime for the entire period of time, but at least 1 year. So we, for instance, do not have the United States in our sample, but we do, as you saw, have Mexico, which is clearly no longer a dictatorship. I think that was the answer. I hope they email back if that was not actually.
Yeah, if there's something else to ask, I'm sure the person can ask another question. While we're waiting for that, Clay Fuller asks, is this published anywhere? I'm writing my dissertation on this topic, and I use a general exploratory factor score to measure it. I assume it being personalism.
Mm-hmm. No, we have not published this anywhere yet. This is mostly a massive data collection project, and has been for about 2 years now. So we're still working on collecting the data. We have not published it anywhere. In part, that's why we're not making the paper publicly available yet, though.
How long do you think I know this is a pretty big project. How long do you think it'll be before the data set is released?
I don't actually know the answer to that. In part because I don't actually know how long it's going to take for us to complete all the data collection. We're hoping to be done with it by the end of the semester. Mm-hmm. But it's in the absence of knowing that, it's really hard to answer that. Mm-hmm. All of the data that I presented today is publicly available from the sources listed.
Mm-hmm. But not the overall factor score or IRT score that you created out of it, right?
No, not that.
Right. Okay, so Leanne Poner asks,
hi, Leanne.
Oh, have you considered using taxing and spending behavior, as in someone institutes taxes or spends without a national budget, or is that getting too close to an institutional characteristic? One of the things I personally associate with personalist behavior is unfettered spending.
Well, we're not currently collecting data on that. I think that's a really good idea, and I think we should, now that you mention it. Those sort of economic measures are, of course, very near and dear to my heart as, a political economist at heart. So we don't have data on that. That's actually reasonably easy to get, though. So we should be able to get data from the Open Budgets Project on whether there was a budget, the spending on top of the budget, the sources of taxation, and so on and so forth. I don't think that's too institutional. Thank you.
Well, so dovetailing with that question, every once in a while you'll see somebody who takes the Martin Quinn scores of judicial ideology and then tries to use them to test the hypothesis that ideology is what influences judicial behavior,
Right.
not voting, but sort of how they make decisions.
Yeah.
And that's sort of like obviously wrong, because the measure is constructed out of voting behavior. So ultimately you're predicting Y with Y.
But it's statistically significant,
right.
I'm sure.
It's a great predictor, right? Y predicts Y super well.
Right.
And even out of sample, it's dumb, because it's a bad idea, because if you do that, you're basically defining ideology as voting behavior and then predicting past voting behavior.
Right.
So what's the you mentioned there are a lot of theories you can test with this data, and I'm wondering sort of what are the sort of open areas that are interesting that don't fall into that trap, and then some other things that would fall into that trap, because you don't want to do that mistake. Right.
And so that's actually one of the fundamental tensions in trying to develop this model, is because we want to include as many indicators as we can, getting such a wide, like a really broad picture of what personalism looks like, but we don't want to preclude ourselves from doing research on it in the future. I personally am really interested in how personalism influences investment, since I mostly study investment, and how it influences how, if you see personalism changing as more foreign direct investment flows in, which is actually really similar to Eddie Molesky's 2008 paper about subnational governments in authoritarian regimes. So, for instance, we're not including anything involving non-state actors in our measure. But yeah, as you rightly point out, one of the problems is that if we include data on budgets, we can't test theories about budgets. So when we do make the data publicly available, we'll also make the code and everything publicly available, so that hopefully people can leave out the thing that they're interested in testing. And that's also something that we're going to look at the sensitivity of the measure to any individual indicator.
One of the things that the people I suspect would be interested in is transitions to and from autocracy.
Right.
And so that it strikes me that this measure, at least sort of, I'd have to think carefully about whether you could use the data to test that, because in some ways you're testing whether they're doing the things that cause the transition. Meaning, for example, if you purge a lot of people, you're transitioning to autocracy, maybe.
Oh, yeah. So in our sample, all of these are already categorized as authoritarian regimes. And of course, that does get kind of sticky, because to some extent, at least our definition of personalism right now suggests you can only be a personalist if you are authoritarian, which current events suggest may not necessarily be true. And we would love to get data on democracies. So you could probably predict transitions to and from democracy in a formal sense. We haven't done that. And right now it would be, right now it would be possible to do that, I think. Other things you'd be able to do with our measure, because we're not including anything, would be many of the things I talked about when I talked about ways personalists are different. So we don't have anything about your conflictual behavior with the international community. We don't have anything on investment. Currently, we don't have any economic measures. We don't have information about how wars start or end, or who's likely to engage in them. We will be having, we do have data we've been using as a validity check on how the regime ends, but we're not including that in the model.
So if I guess one thing I'm curious about is you mentioned that democracies could, at least in principle, be personalistic.
Yeah.
But I associate personalistic regimes with the kind of human rights abuses and suppression of the media that sort of define, at least not a liberal, the opposite of a liberal democracy. Maybe you could have some kind of elections, but they wouldn't be really competitive. What would a how would a personalist democracy exist that wasn't sort of in some ways not really a democracy?
So, personalism is not necessarily conceptually defined to autocracies because it's just how you behave in the absence of institutions. So it could be theoretically possible, and I think we can all think of some cases off the top of our heads, where leaders don't actually appear to be constrained in their behavior by institutions, perhaps because the institutions are slow acting or the institutions are weaker than were previously believed. But things like human rights abuses, that's something that tends to correlate really well with personalism, perhaps because we mostly talk about personalism in the context of autocracies, but it's not in turn something that defines personalism.
Yeah, I mean, the trick is, like, you can think of a case like Hugo Chavez, who, won elections, and at least initially, where they seemed to be legitimate elections. But then by the end, it wasn't clear, it wasn't clear to me whether Venezuela would still really be a democracy, right? Because he was almost ruling personally. And well, anyway, go on.
Chavez comes up very, very high on our measure of personalism. Right. So we have to be careful, of course, in how we define the cases that we choose to measure, because, of course, the IRT model is sort of by its nature a relative measure. But we would predict, our model does predict that Chavez is particularly personalist. So, of course, having elections does not mean you are a democracy by any stretch of the imagination. We could probably do some work to use our measure to predict whether elections are fraudulent, whether, all sorts of other characteristics of elections. So that's something that theoretically could be interesting to look at with the measure.
Well, you mentioned correlation of your measure with ex-cont, right, which is obviously a part of the polity democracy score.
Right.
So, in that sense, the polity score is almost defining democracy as it constraints on the executive, which are almost always institutional.
Exactly.
So it's, that's why I'm kind of getting confused about, well, what does a democratic personalist regime look like? It's got to be one where there's virtually no constraint on the executive. Well, okay, you can imagine sort of mob rule, right? That the president or whoever it is has the support of the mob. But then the question is that really a democracy anymore? That, at that point, maybe it's not really it's ruled by a majority, but that typically considered democracy to be more than simply ruled by the majority.
Yeah, well, you could theoretically have a democracy where the institutions have mostly been informal norms. I'm not an Americanist. I can't remember what year this happened, but right. So it didn't used to be that we had a formal rule about 2 terms. It was just an informal norm. So you could have issues like that where people have constrained themselves. Theoretically, I think actually almost the opposite of what you're talking about is almost more interesting, though. So there are cases in our data where you have leaders who don't have institutional constraints, that are autocracies, but still don't behave in ways we'd associate with personalism. And this is what really drove me on this idea that just because you can doesn't mean you will. So we can't necessarily infer how you will behave from how the institutions allow you to behave. And so I think digging into those cases more deeply, and then looking into the democracies where we might think that they're heavily constrained, but they don't behave as if they were, that could also be particularly interesting to look at. That's, I think, in general, one of the biggest problems with looking at institutions is because we're trying to infer what you would do hypothetically. We're trying to assume that you would all behave this way if you weren't constrained, but that's not necessarily true. There may be no incentive, or it could be personality traits, or it could, there could be all these other reasons why you might not behave in that way, even if in theory you could.
All right. Well, I think we're basically out of time, so I'm gonna go ahead and end the talk. Thank you very much, Jane, for your talk today. Next week, I want to announce this would be February 24th at noon Eastern. We will host a talk by Ines Levin of the University of California at Irvine. You can see our website, www.methods-colloquium.com, to get more information about this talk and the rest of our schedule for the spring of 2017. Jane, thank you very much for your talk.
Thank you.
And I'll see everyone next week.